Hi everybody, welcome back to a time of thinking about the Word of our Master. And today, in a very special way, thinking about the Master himself. Because there's a conversation we're going to be considering today that we might have to take a few videos to work through. Because this is not just about what Jesus said, it's about what his disciples say of him. And what he says in response. And it's just such a foundational picture of Jesus' vision for us today as it has been for all of his disciples since this conversation. So we're in Matthew 16 verses 13 to 20. Before we read it though, I just wanted to point out, I know today is the final debate between our presidential candidates. I know politics, for those who have any interest in it at all, can be an obsession these days. Some people are totally disgusted by the whole topic altogether. Some people are all in and are kind of eating, breathing, and dreaming of politics right now. But I want to just point out as we go into this text that what Jesus is bringing out here has huge ramifications for the spirit realm, the earthly realm, the political realm, all the realms. Because if what we're seeing here is true, it affects everything. And I hope to explore that, probably not in this video, because like I say, there's so much here, we might have to do it piecemeal. But just keep in mind as you're considering what to do with the political questions, what to do with your own participation in the political questions, that at the center of that too is this man that we call Master. He's not master of the religious realm, and then there are masters in other realms. He is the master of all realms, and I'm trying to keep that focus as I try to navigate the waters of current political issues and what role I'm supposed to play in it. And I hope that you will do that as well. Jesus as the master of all spheres, all realms. And that clarity is something we can help in offering the world. Jesus is at the heart of all of it, right? Now, let's get to it. In Matthew 16, starting in verse 13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are," the NIV says, "the Messiah." Now, the Greek word there would have been Christ, Christos. The actual meaning of the word is anointed. You are the anointed, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of the heavens. Whatever you bind on earth will be," or, as a footnote indicates, you could read, "will have been," "bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be, or will have been, loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Woo, man, there's a lot going on here. So, to try to keep these videos from being too long, because you've got a lot of things going on and probably a lot of different things you're watching, but I want to make sure to bring these little snippets of our Master to you as many days as I can, because if he's at the forefront, if he's on the front burner, if we're meditating on even the smaller snippets, it gives clarity to everything we're doing. And this passage, wow. First of all, it's really important to note where they are. This is going to come into play as we work through this. Caesarea Philippi, they're near a mountain that was considered to be, as many mountains were back then, high places. This particular mountain was considered to be a focal point of various pagan religions. It was a place where the gods were understood to be, to come, to be honored. And archaeologically, we know that there were shrines and holy locations all around this mountain region for various religious expressions of various gods and deities. And there was actually understood to be a place called the Gate of Hades, the Gate of the Underworld, in this area. Now that's going to come up if you're noting the reference to Hades here. That's going to come up. The Gate of Hades, spoken about by Jesus in a place that was understood to contain such a place. Very interesting. So location matters here. Just wanted to point that out. And what Jesus talks about has a lot of supernatural spirit realm significance that I didn't know. I couldn't have understood that until some really insightful scholars shared their work, and I got to read it and listen to it. So I'm really excited to share some of those things with you. But we're not quite there yet, because there's a story here between Jesus and his disciples. Before we get to the implications for the spirit realm, let's look at this, the more personal element of this. So Jesus does something that so far in the narrative of Matthew is pretty uncharacteristic. He brings a focus to himself in terms of talking to his disciples. We haven't really seen that very much in the narrative so far. He asks them something that you don't get the sense Jesus is too concerned with, which is his public image. Who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, Son of Man is his favorite reference for himself in terms of the frequency of references to himself. And there's a lot to that. It's rooted in Daniel, no doubt. Daniel 7 saw someone like a son of man coming to the Ancient of Days on a cloud, and he receives all honor and glory from the peoples of earth. So there's certainly that element. The way Jesus uses it in other places seems to really clearly indicate it's a designation of much greater meaning than just human. I mean, that's what Son of Man means, mortal human. But he uses it in a way that it's more than that. So anyway, the question is interestingly asked, who do people say the Son of Man is? He didn't say, who do people say I am? Who do people say the Son of Man is? Kind of, what's your sense, guys? What's your take? You've been around these people as they're talking with each other. What are they saying? And someone perhaps suggests that Jesus didn't really wonder, like he would have known already, either supernaturally or just he's aware of things as he observes. So if that's true, which maybe isn't, but if that's true, then why would he ask? And you could say, well, he just wanted this conversation to start. It's kind of a leading question to get where we're going here, because he wants to find out what the disciples themselves say. Now, I'm not sure that the disciples needed that introductory question. It's not like Jesus is always so subtle that he couldn't just get right to the question of what they say about him. So, all to say, I'm not sure why Jesus asked. Perhaps he was really curious. Divine knowledge was certainly something Jesus had, but I don't know if that means we have to conclude he knew everything about everything. When he took on mortal flesh, there were limitations, and knowledge seems like could have been one of those. In fact, you have to kind of assume Jesus plays a lot of games if you're going to assume he knew everything about everything in his mortal ministry. Because if you remember that lady that touched his garment from behind, he stops the crowd moving to go to Jairus' house, and do you remember his question? Who touched me? The disciples are, what do you mean, who touched you? You're surrounded by all kinds of people walking in a crowd, you know. So there are times that Jesus indicates he's not aware of something. So it's possible that he's genuinely asking, taking a poll of the disciples what they're noticing. Whatever the case, the answer, I think, is really interesting. the disciples are reporting to Jesus, some are saying that you're John the Baptizer. By the way, King Herod, not Herod the Great, we'll call him Junior, Herod Jr., he thought that. He heard about what was happening with Jesus, and he had ordered the execution of John the Baptizer, and so he was afraid that John the Baptizer was back, and now he's got miraculous powers. I mean, how scary for Herod, right? So this was a thing people were thinking, because John the Baptizer, we really must not evaluate or undervalue, I should say, the role that John the Baptizer played. Just such a tremendous and powerful figure in the work of God in the life of Israel at that time. So if Jesus is such a profoundly significant figure to the public, it's not weird or surprising to think they're connecting him over to John the Baptizer. Now, they don't have images of him everywhere. The images of John aren't up on walls or TV screens. So when people hear about things through the rumor mill, through word of mouth, they don't have images to say, that's not John the Baptizer, they look totally different, or anything like that. They're going purely on word of mouth, no visuals there, and so, you can see how people might confuse that. Anyway, others say Elijah. This would be also a tremendously significant thing for people to think, because Elijah was promised before the coming of the servant of the Lord, the Messiah figure. And before the great and dreadful day of Yahweh, Elijah's supposed to come back. That's what was promised through Malachi, right at the close of what we call the Old Testament. So if they think that this is Elijah, they're thinking it's go time. The kingdom really is here. The end of the age really has come, right? Now, interestingly, those two answers show a connection that Jesus gives us, that John the Baptizer was the Elijah to come. That's what he told his disciples. Anywho, so the other thing that they report is that some are saying that you're Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. This is so weird to me, because this suggests some idea of reincarnation or something. As far as we know, Elijah was understood to be someone who didn't die, at least not like most other people. He was taken up into a heaven, either the sky or somewhere, and we lose track of where he went, and so maybe he died, maybe he didn't. But he didn't die like most people. He was taken away. We don't know what his death was, if he ever died. The other prophets, died. So the idea that they would think he was one of the prophets returned is really interesting in light of the Jewish understanding of life and death and the afterlife. It's not like they believe in reincarnation, as far as we know. So what's going on with that? Now, why Jeremiah specifically? I don't know. One thought is, Jesus has already been giving indications of speaking of the judgment that's coming on Israel, that's coming on Jerusalem specifically. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet who spoke of that as well, and also spoke of God's promises about a new covenant and those kinds of things. So it's possible people were kind of getting a vibe from Jesus' message that they related to Jeremiah. I don't know. It's interesting. Now, Jesus listens to all that. None of them are right, okay? They're all off. And so he asks these men who've been with him day after day, who have worked with him and have received his authority and have shared his message, all of those things. They've seen the wonders that he's capable of accomplishing in God's power. And he asks them the key question, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Now, this time he doesn't say Son of Man. Who do you say the Son of Man is? This time he goes more personal. Who do you say I am? Now, as you're looking Jesus in the face, if they're willing to do that, this is a moment of truth. Because they could have said all kinds of things that were obvious, but not really that helpful. You're a rabbi. You are a wonder worker. Yes. You're a prophet of God. Okay. Right. So they could have said things that were safe and not all that controversial within their group. These are things that were obvious. But Jesus is pushing them to see, how do they perceive him? What have they come to conclude about him? Now, just because they decided to follow Jesus as rabbi and master does not mean that they automatically think him the Messiah or automatically understand he's the Son of God the way we understand that, born of a virgin, conceived by God's own Spirit. It just means that they understand he's the one they need to follow to learn of God and the kingdom in the best way. So this is a really important question. At this point of our life together, men, what's your conclusion about me? Now, Peter says something that, according to the Gospel of John, isn't unique yet, or in the story thus far. Because there's another person who, in John's Gospel, very early on, concludes that Jesus is Messiah. But here, after spending all this time working through it all, Peter, in his observations, receives a revelation from, according to Jesus, a revelation from Father himself, that he is the anointed one, the Son of God. And I'm going to focus on just this part of it and save a lot of the meat of the rest of it for another time. But I think it's worth pausing and simply celebrating the fact that Jesus is the anointed one of God. He is the Son of God. And the question that Jesus posed to them, he would pose to any of his disciples, and he might pose it along the way of your life lived with him. What do you say? Not what does your pastor say, not what does your mom or dad say, your grandma and grandpa, your husband or wife. What do the memes on Facebook say that you like or share? What do you say? What have you concluded? Now, what you conclude doesn't make it true or not true, but it matters because it will determine what you do with him and about him and for him. So Jesus is actually interested to find out, what have you concluded about me? Now, Peter answers correctly, and he is commended by Jesus. But I want to talk about, just briefly, these two identifiers. Because I know this is common understanding. This is, if you're a Christian, this is like, duh, let's get to the other stuff. But no, not disciples of Jesus. We don't rush by things that we already know. We savor the things that we already know because they change everything. First of all, he says, you are the anointed. And that's a loaded term for the Jews of that time. The Jewish communities had begun to formulate ideas of Messiah that, as far as we know from our records that we've found, weren't that clearly formulated before. This is a time period when, with the rule of Rome there and tensions rising between Israel and Rome, there were a lot of would-be messiahs arising. There's a lot of talk within different communities of Jews about the end of the age coming and the new age beginning and all of those things. And so the anointed one, biblically in the Old Testament, could be applied to a king, it could be applied to a priest, it could be applied to a pagan king God was going to use in a special way, King Cyrus, for instance, of Persia. So to be anointed by God simply means to be chosen for a particular and special task. But when in this time period you speak of the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christos, depending on which language you're speaking, that carried some weight, that carried some baggage. So for Peter to say, not just you are a anointed one to do something special, John the Baptizer was in that sense an anointed one to do something special. Before he was even born, before he was even conceived in the womb of his aged mother, John the Baptizer had a destiny to fulfill for God's purposes. But he wasn't the anointed. When Peter says that Jesus is the anointed, savor that with me, because God had a choice to make, and he chose Jesus, and it was the very best choice possible. I mean, everything he says, everything he does proves it over and over again. And in this election cycle, am I right? That if you could choose anyone to lead a nation like the United States of America, a state like Pennsylvania, where I am, or a church family, or anything, when you choose a leader, there are huge consequences. And it's a heavy burden to select someone to lead anything important. Well, God had the one decisive vote in who would rule heavens and earth at his right hand, to whom he would entrust the authority to rule heavens and earth. And the nation of Israel, by the way, and unite the nation of Israel back again into the house of David. When God had all of this to choose, he chose someone, and he chose perfectly. Think about what the anointed was being called to accomplish. And we have to worship. We have to be moved to worship in admiration and gratitude, because God could have chosen a real loser. God could have chosen a real brutal dictator. God could have chosen someone who was childish and petulant or greedy and self-serving. He chose the very best, the only one who could do it right. He chose Jesus of Nazareth. Wow. And Peter understood, with God's help, that Jesus was not just a prophet. He was not just a special servant for a special time. He was the servant for all of time, for God to do the great work he always intended to do. He's the mystery finally revealed. Wow. How much Peter understood of that? It's hard to tell. Probably not much. But Peter understood. And the second thing is that Peter acknowledges that he is the Son of God. Now, I do want to caution you, do not assume that when Peter said that, he was thinking Jesus was born of a virgin, God was his literal father, because Mary conceived by the Holy Spirit overshadowing her. It's really not clear if the apostles had any notion of Jesus being born of a virgin. I mean, is it impossible that they heard about that? No, because they've spent time with Mary. I mean, it's very possible they heard the story. I don't know. And that's part of what I'm bringing up. The message of the apostles, the message of Jesus, never brings up his origins of being born from a virgin. We have it in our narrative in both Matthew and Luke, but that's Matthew and Luke telling us, the audience reading their works. You never hear it spoken of by Jesus or the apostles in their earthly ministries. So I don't know. I don't know what Peter knew about that. So what could he mean if he didn't mean that God is the literal father of this person walking around? Well, the Jews had an interesting history with this phrase, Son of God. And in a lot of ways, it was connected to the idea of a chosen one as well. So, for instance, just to give you an idea of what I mean, David was promised by God to have a lasting and enduring dynasty in the life of Israel, if his descendants would honor him and obey him. That didn't work out. The chain was broken. Jesus was going to restore that. But God promised that David would have a son, and that God would consider that son of David his own son. And in other words, God was promising to be a father to that descendant of David who would take the throne. That ended up being Solomon. The idea of being a son of God doesn't, in that Jewish sense of their Old Testament scriptures, doesn't mean that you are divine. It doesn't mean that you were born of a virgin and didn't have a human father. What it meant was that you were, in a sense, adopted by God to be specially cared for by God, and that you had a special function and role to play for God. So what did Peter think and have in mind when he said that Jesus was Son of God? I don't know. But I just wanted to encourage you not to jump to the conclusion that he has an Orthodox Christian view that we've developed over the centuries of the church through what the Scriptures reveal. When did the disciples become crystal clear on Jesus' origins, being born of a virgin, that God is literally his father? I don't know. But that term had meaning even before those things came about. To be a son of God was very, very similar in a lot of ways to being the anointed. What Peter was claiming, whatever else we're thinking in those terms, what Peter was claiming was that Jesus was unique and it was in a sense ultimate for servants of God. Now what Jesus is going to do in response, which we're not going to cover now, is to affirm that Peter is exactly right. And not just that, but that God himself affirms it. Now, if that's true, if you're a fellow disciple of mine watching this, if that's true, I hope that is of the utmost encouragement to you. That the one we follow is the ultimate servant of God. That's why we want to be like Him. That's why everything that people tell us in His name ought to help us become like Him. Everything ought to be focused on Him. And any political leaders that arise in these days, they need to play their roles and play them well. They're important. But nobody and nothing comes close to the ultimate servant and Son of God, anointed of God, Jesus of Nazareth. I hope that you will re-pledge yourself to Him today, that you will worship Him afresh today, and God as well. For God chose well, for the good of everyone in the cosmos. God chose well for the good of everyone in the cosmos. And I hope that like Peter, and like I will do now, you will affirm with joy and absolute confidence, Jesus is the Anointed One. He is the Son of the living God. Amen? Amen. God bless you, and I look forward to looking at Jesus' response, because it tells us so much about who we're meant to be and what we're meant to do as His people.